When you think about World War II, it's easy to picture this one single massive explosion that started it all. But that's not really how it happened. It wasn't just one thing. It was more like a chain reaction, right? A series of dominoes, each one knocking over the next, building momentum until the entire world was pushed over the edge. So in this explainer, that's exactly what we're going to do. We're going to trace that chain link by link to really understand how it all went down.
And that quote, it really hits the nail on the head. There was no single spark. It was a whole conspiracy of events, all working together. So yeah, we're going to follow that domino effect, this unstoppable momentum that just built and built towards global war. And our journey, it doesn't start on a battlefield. Nope. It begins in a grand hall in France. Yeah, not a bang, but a signature. See, after World War I, everybody was desperate for peace. They'd just been through the war to end all wars, and they wanted to make sure it never happened again. But the treaty they signed to guarantee that peace, well, it did the exact opposite. It pretty much planted the seeds for an even bigger, even more devastating war just 20 years down the road.
So let's get into it. We're talking, of course, about the Treaty of Versailles. You have to remember, after World War I, the Allies, especially France, were reeling. The cost in lives and money was just unimaginable. So their number one goal was punishment. They wanted to make absolutely certain that Germany could never threaten Europe again. But, and this is the huge but, in doing that, they created the perfect breeding ground for resentment, for chaos, and for the rise of extremism.
I mean, just look at this number, $270 billion. That's the modern equivalent of the fine Germany was forced to pay. It was an absolutely crippling amount of money. So crippling, in fact, that Germany didn't make its final payment until, get this, 2010. Can you believe that? A debt from World War I was still being paid off in the 21st century?
And as bad as the money was, this might have been even worse. Article 231, the infamous War Guilt Clause. It basically forced Germany to sign on the dotted line and say, yep, the entire war, all the death, all the destruction, it was 100% our fault. This wasn't just a financial penalty. It was a deep national humiliation. And that kind of anger, it doesn't just go away, it festers. And that leads us right into our next section. The economic fallout was immediate, and it was catastrophic. The German government had this impossible bill to pay. So what did they do? They just started printing more money and more, which of course sent the value of their currency into a complete nosedive. The whole economy went into a death spiral of hyperinflation. And in that kind of chaos, when people are desperate, it creates the perfect storm for someone to step in and exploit it.
To really get a sense of how insane things got, just look at the price of a loaf of bread. In 1922, it cost about 160 marks. Okay, just 1 year later, that same loaf of bread cost 200 billion marks. Let that sink in. People were using wheelbarrows full of cash just to buy groceries. Your life savings could become worthless literally overnight. German society was collapsing.
And who steps into this chaos? Adolf Hitler. He was a master at taking all that public anger and humiliation and pointing it at a target. He blamed Germany's problems on internal enemies, Jews, socialists, you name it. He even tried a coup in 1923. It failed, but it only made him more famous. Then, the Great Depression hits in 1929, unemployment skyrockets to 6 million, and people were desperate for a savior. By 1933, Hitler had seized absolute power. Okay, so now he's in control. The first thing he does is start tearing up the Treaty of Versailles. He begins rearming Germany and starts talking about a new German empire. And this is when the dominoes really start to fall. He starts making moves, testing the waters, pushing the boundaries to see just how far the other European powers would let him go. The first domino was Austria. In 1938, Hitler's army just marched right in. His argument was pretty simple. Hey, they're German-speaking people, we're German-speaking people. We should all be one country. The takeover was completely bloodless, and honestly, thanks to a ton of propaganda, a lot of Austrians actually welcomed the German troops.
Next up, Czechoslovakia. Now, Britain and France were desperate to avoid another war, so they met with Hitler and basically struck a deal. They said, okay, you can have this one German-speaking part of Czechoslovakia, the Sudetenland, but in return, you have to promise, that's it, peace. Hitler gladly took the land, and then, just a few months later, broke his promise and invaded the rest of the country. And that brings us to the final domino, Poland.
In a brilliant but totally cynical move, Hitler signs a non-aggression pact with his biggest ideological enemy, the Soviet Union. Nobody saw this coming. Secretly, the deal allowed them to carve up Poland between them. This was a huge win for Hitler because it meant he could attack Poland without having to fight a war on two fronts. So on September 1st, 1939, German troops stormed across the border. 2 days later, Britain and France declared war.
And just like that, the war had begun. But this was not going to be a repeat of the trench warfare of World War I. No. What happened next absolutely shocked the world. It was the terrifying speed and efficiency of the German army, all thanks to a revolutionary new military tactic. It was called Blitzkrieg, which is German for lightning war. And the name says it all. The entire strategy was built around two things: overwhelming speed and absolute surprise. It was designed to be psychologically and physically devastating, to end battles before the enemy even had time to figure out what hit them.
So here's how it worked. Think of it like a 1-2-3 punch. First, you have fast-moving panzer tanks that spearhead the attack, punching huge holes deep in the enemy lines. At the same time, you have the Luftwaffe, Germany's air force, dominating the skies, bombing key targets and supporting the ground troops. This combined assault was so fast it left defenders confused, surrounded, and with pretty much no choice but to surrender. But the Blitzkrieg had a secret weapon. To keep up this inhuman pace, German soldiers were given a drug called Pervitin. We know it today as crystal meth. Yeah. It allowed them to fight for days on end without sleep, suppressing their hunger and fear, and turning them into relentless, supercharged warriors. So armed with this lightning Moore strategy and fueled by drugs, Germany unleashed its full fury on Western Europe in the spring of 1940. The speed of the conquest was simply breathtaking. It left the Allies completely reeling. So France thought it was safe. They had built the Maginot Line, this massive string of high-tech fortifications on its border with Germany. They thought it was impenetrable, but the Germans didn't attack it head-on. In a brilliant move, they just went around it. They sent their main force through the dense Ardennes forest, a route the French considered impassable for tanks. And just like that, they outflanked the Allied armies, trapping hundreds of thousands of them against the coast. This led to the legendary miracle of Dunkirk. You had Allied soldiers trapped on the beaches with the German army closing in. What happened next was incredible. A massive evacuation, Operation Dynamo, was launched. Over 9 days, a whole flotilla of naval ships, civilian fishing boats, even yachts, sailed across the channel and rescued nearly 350,000 soldiers, saving the core of the British Army from being completely wiped out. But even with that miraculous rescue, the strategic situation was a complete catastrophe. With its best armies lost, France surrendered in June of 1940. To any outside observer looking at the continent, it really seemed like the war was already over. It looked like Hitler had won. The scale of his conquest was just breathtaking. By the middle of 1940, Hitler was the undisputed master of Europe. You have Austria, Poland, Denmark, Norway, Belgium, Luxembourg, the Netherlands, and now France. From Warsaw to Paris, the Nazi flag was flying. The continent had fallen. And that's where we're going to leave it. With nearly all of Europe under his boot and a peace pact with the Soviet Union, Hitler had achieved a stunning victory. Only the island nation of Britain remained defiant. The question on everyone's mind was, how could they possibly survive? Was defeat inevitable?